Now I'm thrilled to introduce EPA Administrator Michael Regan, who will be joined in conversation with his fellow North Carolina A&T alum, Ebony Thomas from Bank of America following his remarks. And Ms. Administrator Regan, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you to C2ES and the Climate Registry for inviting me to join you all today. You know, back in 2018, I spoke at this conference in Denver while serving as Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And I'm really excited to be here again representing the Biden-Harris administration. EPA has a long history collaborating on the Climate Leadership Conference and Awards, and we're honored to be this year's government sponsor. This year marks the 10th anniversary, which is especially noteworthy. Looking back over the past decade, there have been phenomenal accomplishments in climate action. We've seen many of these accomplishments highlighted through the Climate Leadership Awards program already. It's important to celebrate those milestones that have helped transform the market, and I'm grateful to all of you for making that happen. Now, looking forward, I believe that we're at an incredible moment. President Biden has set the bar high when it comes to climate leadership. He's launched the most ambitious plan to tackle this crisis in history, cutting emissions in half by 2030. To get there, the president has adopted a whole of government approach, which means from DOD to EPA, all federal agencies are finally rowing in the same direction towards a clean energy future. I believe this whole of government approach is essential to our success, and EPA has a very important role to play in moving the ball forward. We're taking aggressive action to get our Clean Cars program back on track, to phase down the super pollutants, HFCs, and to deliver a strong proposal to reduce pollution from the oil and gas sector. When these standards are put in place, it will be a huge set of wins for the climate, as well as for healthier communities all across the U.S. But solving the climate crisis can't be done by one country or entity. It requires a global response from every level of government and every sector of the economy. It's going to take all of us. And that means it's going to take the folks in this room and corporate leaders throughout the world to ensure we get this right and that we move quickly and that we create jobs. The business community's ingenuity, creativity, and leadership on climate change are critical to our work in the days ahead. You all are raising the bar on what corporate leadership should mean and must mean in today's world. And when you factor climate change into your bottom line, you prove that the health of our economy and the health of our environment aren't mutually exclusive, but they actually go hand in hand. And that's the Biden-Harris mentality. The president's plan to build back better recognizes that climate action is one of the single best opportunities we have to strengthen our economy, to improve public health, and to better the quality of life for all people in all communities. EPA recently celebrated 30 years of voluntary climate partnership programs. We've seen that collaboration is key to success in advancing decarbonization. We've worked with tens of thousands of organizations and companies across every sector of the economy to reduce emissions, 6 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions to be exact. That's a total which exceeds all 2019 US carbon dioxide emissions. The success of these programs prove that a united approach, bringing government, business, and market forces together, can help tackle the climate crisis while also create good-paying jobs. Developing and deploying new climate-friendly technologies by working together, sharing information, and basing policies on sound science can help build back our economy stronger than ever. Building back better also requires that we use this moment of opportunity as a rising tide for our underserved and overburdened communities. For decades, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income communities have disproportionately borne the burden of pollution. These are the same communities that live closest to highways and refineries, who face higher rates of heart and lung disease, and whose children are more likely to develop asthma. These inequities don't just harm the communities who experience them, they harm all of us. They hold back our nation from reaching her highest ideals. They hold back our economy. and they hold back the potential for a healthier, safer, and more just future. So it's up to all of us, government, community leaders, NGOs, and the private sector. We must work together to correct these longstanding injustices. And so we need your spirit of innovation, creativity, and outsized influence to help us all meet this moment. We need your voices out there more than ever to make the case for aggressive action. We have an opportunity to harness your expertise, to expand the collective ambition, and to secure a better future for everyone. So once again, congratulations on the 10th anniversary of your conference and your awards. After a 4-year hiatus, EPA is proud to be rejoining our partners who joined us in helping to establish this critically important awards program. We have a lot of work ahead of us and so much opportunity as well. So I'm looking forward to all that we'll accomplish together by working closely together once again. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hello, Ebony. It's so great to see you.
Nice to see you as well, Administrator Regan. And thank you, Amy, for the warm introduction. And I also want to take a moment to thank our longstanding partners, C2ES, for hosting today's session and the thought leadership you bring to our organization and others in our global transition to low carbon economy. So thank you. At Bank of America, we believe everyone has a right to a healthy, sustainable, and livable environment. We're focused on this through a number of environmental and social and governance and ESG initiatives, including the commitment that I have the honor of leading, which is our $1.2 billion over 5 years to build on our longstanding work in support of driving racial equality and economic opportunity. We've already had a year into this work, and we're already starting to see some small benefits and incremental change that's happening within the communities that we live and the communities in which we serve. We've also committed $1.2 trillion in sustainable business and sustainable finance over the next 10 years, and $1 trillion of which will be directed toward low carbon sustainable business activities. We also deliver on these commitments, and we think about how our under-resourced communities that we live and we serve in are more adversely impacted, to Administrator Regan's point, by climate change and pollution. We see this in the burdens that these communities face from polluted land, water, air, lack of access, clean energy, and transportation options. Environmental justice connects the E and the S within ESG, which is critically important. At Bank of America, we're working across our firm to ensure a just transition, whether through sustainable finance, philanthropy, employee volunteerism, to ensure that additional resources can offset these negative impacts. We're also helping our clients across the globe, bringing clean energy and technologies, sustainable transportation, and other solutions to the forefront. Finally, we're working with partners to create opportunities in renewable energy and address historic patterns of pollution and people and communities of color through our work with Alternative Grid, Solar Corps, who are providing jobs and upskilling to minority communities, as well as our work with Groundswell to bring solar energy and reduce utility bills to communities of color, specifically in Washington, D.C. So with that, I want to get into it, Administrator Regan, and I would be remiss if I did not say a quick Aggie Pride.
Aggie Pride.
Absolutely. And, I don't think it's by accident that the university that we love so much, North Carolina A&T, which is historically Black college in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the work that I have the opportunity to lead, which is around racial equality and economic opportunity, and you being the EPA director, I don't think it's by chance or happenstance that we happen to be here today. And I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Well, Ebony, thank you for that question. And I have to agree with you that North Carolina produces some great products, and it's a great state. And so it's great to share the stage with you, a fellow Aggie. I'd like to say that my time at A&T was incredibly empowering. It set the trajectory for my career. And I don't believe that I would be where I am today without my A&T experience. I was honored to serve my home state as Secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality. And I'm bringing much of the lessons I learned in North Carolina to this role as EPA Administrator. Throughout my career, I learned that if we want to address complex challenges, we must be able to see them from all sides. We must be willing to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And that was certainly true in North Carolina, and it's true here in Washington, D.C. at EPA. As secretary, I also had a front row seat to the importance of federal and state relationships and what a difference transparency, respect, and open dialogue could make. State and local governments know their communities much better than the federal government ever could. So I'm bringing that understanding to my role at EPA. And I'm focused on not only building important relationships with the states, because their partnerships are critical, but with our corporate sector, our nonprofit sector. These are the places where the rubber meets the road. So rebuilding all of these relationships is a top priority for me at EPA.
And listen, as a North Carolinian, a native North Carolinian, we thank you for your service, the impact that you've had as the EPA leader here in North Carolina, and now taking that work at the national and global level. We definitely feel that impact. So we appreciate all that you do, Administrator Regan. One of the points you made earlier was we were talking about the Build Back Better agenda. And as we think about that work, and particularly the White House Justice 40 effort that connects Biden's plan to integrate climate consideration across the federal government. And you talked about moving in one solid direction. Can you tell us a little bit more about the initiative and how you think that connects specifically to that Build Back Better program?
Absolutely. This is a rising tide moment, and Justice 40 is about ensuring that the benefits of the federal government's investments are delivered to the communities who've long borne the pollution burden, our Black, our Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income communities. These communities that are living closest to the pollution sources, they face higher rates of heart and lung disease. Their children are more likely to develop asthma. So, EPA just released a report that shows the most severe harms from climate change fall disproportionately on underserved communities who are least able to prepare for and recover from climate-fueled disasters. Black and African Americans are 34% more likely to currently live in areas with the highest projected increase in childhood asthma diagnosis as our temperatures rise. Hispanics and Latino individuals are 43% more likely to currently live in areas with the highest projected reductions in labor hours due to extreme temperatures from climate change. So as we meet the challenges of the climate crisis, we must prioritize equity considerations in delivering economic, health, job, and environmental benefits for a cleaner economy. So that's what Justice 40 is doing, and that's how it's connected to the president's Build Back Better plan, because in the president's Build Back Better plan, it's going to be a shot in the arm to advance environmental justice, but also infrastructure investments. $50 billion alone for EPA to accelerate water infrastructure improvements, including replacing 100% of the lead pipes that are in this country. $21 billion to EPA to address longstanding pollution in communities, including $5 billion for Superfund and brownfield sites cleanup. $17 billion to tackle congestion and emissions near ports, and then another $7.5 billion in electric vehicle infrastructure, prioritizing EV charging stations in underserved communities. So there's a direct connection to these historic investments from Build Back Better to Justice 40 and all of our desire to focus on environmental justice and use it as a rising tide.
It's such a sense of urgency, not just for these communities that you've talked about, but really a sense of urgency for the entire globe. I mean, for us to address these particular issues, we address them in all communities. And so I appreciate you bringing that to everyone's attention and how that connection to that work and the Build Back Better agenda is tightly connected. So I'm in the private sector. So it's always interesting, and we'd love to hear, how do you think the private sector and the notion of this partnership between public and private, that we can really learn a lot from your agenda across the EPA, but the things that you also see across the globe. So what do you think the role between the public and private sector around your work?
There is a great opportunity for public-private partnerships for all of these efforts, and it has to be intentional. At EPA, we're looking at every single action, whether they be regulatory, permitting, enforcement, contracts, procurement. Everything is intentionally being looked at through an environmental justice lens, because we know that every decision we make will impact communities who disproportionately impacted pollution have been impacted for decades. The business community can and should do the same, because fighting injustice requires that all of us are in this together. So I think we have an obligation collectively, both public and private sector, to meet people where they are. That starts with prioritizing our engagement, meeting with the members of our communities, listening to their needs, seeing the need up close, like not sitting behind a desk, but seeing the need up close, and coming away with the real understanding of how we all deliver products to our communities. We have a responsibility to build trust in our communities that we serve and operate in. And that is just as true for government as it is for the private sector. So we have to be collaborative partners. And if we want to advance justice and be partners in the communities, then that means collectively together, as we work together, we have to show up to those city council meetings or those school board meetings, make investments in our local county hospital districts, and stand with the community as we pursue these clean energy and economic development opportunities. I think it's really powerful when the government and private sector come together, show up together, and stand up to support communities together. And so it's a matter of us just being intentional and working together.
You know, I love the words that you use there. I mean, you started out with intentional. Obligation, right, is so critical and important around not only the obligation from the private sector, but from the everyday citizen, this notion of empowering individuals with information so that when they show up to these local, state houses, that they're armed with the information and they know what they're advocating and they're fighting for. So I think the intentional nature of not only the public and private sector and the collaboration, but also arming everyday citizens with information so that they can show up and advocate on their behalf, which is so critically important. So let's stay on this theme around the private sector and kind of our role. So how can the private sector help to improve climate resilience and economic well-being of marginalized and under-resourced communities? You know, are there ways that the private sector could partner, quite honestly, with the EPA to do some of this work? So, you know, what's our role in terms of climate resilience and economic well-being within these communities, and what ways in which we can partner with the EPA and your teams?
You know, it's an excellent question, and I think there are a few things that we can do together to advance environmental justice. And one of them is to ensure that the investments in infrastructure in these communities is resilient, the investments stay in the communities, and that we're creating economic development opportunities for these communities, creating jobs and expanding access to education. You know, I was in Detroit not too long ago, and I visited Detroit immediately following a major flooding event where this supposed 1,000-year flood had just happened, 2 months after the first or the second 1,000-year flood, where the residents are primarily people of color, and they actually had wastewater flood into their basements. This is where the bipartisan infrastructure deal and Build Back Better are really important, because it's more than just protecting these people from dirty water. It's really about looking at the aging infrastructure and making investments into the infrastructure. But it's the private sector that we need to harness to help bring people to the point where the jobs match the task and we're investing in these communities, providing the investment to the community, creating the jobs, and making our infrastructure more resilient. So we're working every day to be a better partner to the communities through our regulations and policies, but we also have to be a better partner to the business community so that when we show up with these solutions, they're matched with the economic development and job opportunities as well. Our central philosophy has always been centered on collaborative problem solving, and the private sector will always be a necessary part of any kind of collaboration. So we need the private sector at the table, and by showing up together along with other government partners and stakeholders, I think the communities will see something pretty powerful that transcends partisanship. They will see action, they will see protection from pollution, but just as important, they'll see economic development and job opportunities as well.
I mean, I think that piece is so important. When you talk about the investment within the community, the work that I have the honor of leading for Bank of America is around our $1.25 billion to communities of color. And a big part of that is that investment, and a huge link to that are jobs and how we create jobs within those communities. So not just about investing in infrastructure in those communities, but then reinvesting in the people who live in those communities, so that they can then create ecosystems around themselves to be supported, and to maintain these jobs and create new ones that come into these communities. So I think that that investment, but also the investment that stays in those communities are just so critically important. So I thank you for that. So for those out there listening in the private sector, there are ways in which you can partner with the EPA, but there are ways in which you can partner with other organizations as well to make those jobs sustainable within these particular communities. I wanted to switch gears a little bit too and talk to you about, what are some of the long-term efforts or projects that you're working on right now in the EPA? We've really focused right now on environmental justice and the work that's really critical and urgent in front of us. But if you could look maybe out 2 or 3 years, what do you think some of the projects or main bodies of work that you want to talk to our audience about today?
Well, I'll continue with the theme that you just started, which is it's just as much about investing in people as it is infrastructure. And so rebuilding this agency is a top priority for me. There's no doubt that we have some rebuilding to do internally. And that's true when it comes to employee morale, but it's also true when we think about how we continue to be one of the most competitive workforces on the planet. The heart and soul of EPA is its career workforce. The heart and soul of any organization is its workforce. And so public employees who do the work from one administration to the next really isn't in it for the politics. They're in it because they love what they're doing. So under my leadership, I'm really wanting to invest in the career employees, ensuring that their voices are heard, and especially the EPA career scientists and the experts. We need for them to be at the table. There were times during the previous administration or the last few years where the workforce felt distant from the mission that they signed up to do. And what we want to do is have all of our employees live the mission that they signed up for. And through that, we want to revive the workforce, which I believe we can do. And if our workforce is really invigorated, there's nothing that we can't accomplish. We do have some ambitious climate goals to fulfill. The president hasn't been shot. And, I think it's critical that we are on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to think beyond them. We need to think about how our work is articulated in a way where our communities see themselves in this bright future that we're building, how people see their lives actually improving because of the work that we do at EPA. So rebuilding morale, but also making this agency more accessible to our communities and to the general public is something that we really want to focus on.
Well, 2 things, and I know I've been doing this, but I just want to double click down on 2 things that you said that I just thought were fascinating. And I don't want people to just, kind of gloss over this notion of a competitive workforce and what that competitive workforce looks like. It looks highly engaged. They look like they want to be there. They look like they are connected to the work. And that means upskilling even our current level of employees, right? In terms of how they want to continue their career to do meaningful work. And this is certainly a place in which the work that they do has a significant impact and incredibly meaningful. And not just within your organization, but across a number of organizations. That should be a vision and priority for us across all. And the second thing, you talked about is, just the notion of, being mission driven career, within a particular career. And I think when I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of college students, they are really focused on having a purpose-driven career, and certainly one in climate justice across the ESG spectrum is certainly one where we need those voices, we need that expertise, and quite honestly, we need that new energy of how they look at things. And so I truly appreciate those comments there. Look, in our last few minutes, I would be remiss to say we've been in a stress test for the last 18 months or so with COVID, one that we didn't necessarily pick ourselves, but we are in the midst of that stress test. And so I'd love to just know, how has the EPA, what lessons have your administration learned around the impact of COVID and the approach to environmental justice? I mean, it is directly linked, but I'd love to hear your views on that impact of this test, the stress test of COVID that we've been through.
It really has been a stress test for the entire country. But COVID-19, it magnified the injustices that Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income communities have long faced. It showed how issues like climate change and pandemics act as a threat multiplier for our most vulnerable communities. And so from our side, addressing air pollution exposure in overburdened communities is of keen interest. Really taking a look at, how we reduce the most harmful air pollutants along with greenhouse gas emissions throughout many of our rules is something that we believe will alleviate some of the stressors that we've seen. We're also looking at putting $50 million in funding under the American Rescue Plan towards more community-based projects. And we're engaging with community leaders as we prepare to make another $50 million investment in air quality monitoring. What we've really seen is now, more importantly than ever, we have to reduce the burden, the health burdens that many of our communities have faced because they just can't sustain the stress test of another COVID-19. But we also have to look at the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the president's Build Back Better plan. There are billions of dollars in both of these bills in the bipartisan agenda to rebuild the infrastructure. But you made this point earlier, lots of resources in there to rebuild America and rebuild the people of America. So there are tons of investments to make our communities healthier, more resilient, get people back to work, invest in our infrastructure, and make us a more secure country. And I think that in looking at what the president's agenda is and looking at the stress test that COVID-19 presented, we see a direct correlation that the healthier we can make our communities, the more likely they are to sustain and come through these stress tests that we probably will see in the foreseeable future.
So very true. And what a good way to end us this afternoon, Administrator Regan. We appreciate your time. Once again, we want to have a great thank you to this C2ES community. Congratulations again on your 10 years, but an important conversation and excited to have it with my fellow Aggie. And Amy, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, Ebony.
Ebony, thank you so much for joining us today and for your inspiring words. We really appreciate your participation.